We are here just a few days outside of Election Day. We're joined by Tal Eslick and also Matt Klink talking about campaign ads. We've seen a lot of them on our TVs. We've probably seen a lot of them on YouTube, which this is, of course, streaming on too. So, you'll turn this on and you'll probably see ads for Rudy Salas and David Valadao, perhaps John Duarte, Adam Gray, and we just want to talk about the effectiveness of them because some people, they just cannot wait to hit the skip ad button. Some people want to stay in and watch the length and the duration of them. I don't know why. They've been putting them on for a while. But I want to talk about the effectiveness of these ads, and maybe let's just start with the idea of an ad in the first place. Why do we see campaign ads in general? What's the thought that goes into them? Is it more about winning, or is it more about taking votes away from someone? Is it about suppressing a vote? Matt, we'll start with you.
Well, Will, there's that old saying, a picture's worth 1,000 words. And the problem with direct mail is that you're confined to whatever the size of the piece is. But when you run a campaign ad, you're allowed to use visuals and mix visuals with words and graphics. And if you see them over a period of times, they become memorable. And that's what you want to stick in the voters' minds is, vote for Adam Gray, vote for, David Valadao, vote, so it's like the more you see these ads, the more you tend to remember, so that when you cast your ballot, oh, that's right. I like this guy. I've seen his ads. So it's marketing 101. There's a reason why Coke and Pepsi advertise on television too.
Yeah, and Tal, you on that same question. What goes into the thought of creating some of these?
Yeah, and these particular congressional districts, the 22nd congressional and the 13th congressional, both have historically been very competitive in the last few cycles. So you're seeing the ads become a little more provocative. They're targeting sort of more specific audiences because these are districts that are very, very competitive, right? So many voters have already made up their mind in these seats. They're familiar with the candidates because they both are the same folks that ran in 2022. But you see the focus on the right to life issue or the abortion issue, and then something like, say, gas prices, and each of the candidates going after the other's records in a similar fashion, maybe less aggressively so than in 2022. But yeah, TV is sort of the blunt instrument that the campaigns still rely heavily on. The vast majority of the budget will be plowed into television, and it's a great way to reach a lot of people without a level of precision that you may find in mail and certainly in digital. But again, it's sort of where most of these campaigns will spend their time, and more importantly, the resources in both the campaigns. And we should also mention the outside groups that at this point, I think their spending is dwarfing that of the campaigns directly anyway. And that's a lot of the negative campaigning and contrast pieces that you see in both of these races.
We see also a lot about turning back the clock, particularly as it goes to Rudy Salas, 450 missed votes in the state legislature. He came in, talked to us yesterday, say, I've cast tens of thousands of votes in the state legislature. A number of these missed votes, he was trying to say, are based on negotiations that he does, bipartisan negotiations, to vote on some things, vote no on other things. In the same respect, too, we see Rudy talking about, and the ads talking about, Valadao's vote against the infrastructure bill from 2021, in the sense of saying, hey, you had this opportunity to bring taxpayer-funded dollars into the district. Why wouldn't you support something like that? Representative Valadao, of course, giving us a response to that as well, just saying, it didn't have the permitting legislation that would make this a lot more effective and things of that nature, too. But they don't have the opportunity to rebut. You just see the ads on TV. What is the importance of making that point and sticking with that person in situations like this?
Cal, you want to go?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so in both of these races, you have candidates that have lengthy records, whether it's in Congress or in the California Assembly, or in the case of Congressman Valadao, in both. And they're looking to draw out those parts of that job that are most compelling with a relatively modest number of voters at this point. The fact that one of the ads, in the case of the, I guess, anti-Salas commercials, it's focused on attendance, right? So it's sort of the most fundamental thing you can do as an elected official would be show up, right? So I think I assume it's been poll tested. That's pretty common for especially the outside groups. If you're going to spend millions of dollars in ads, you'll spend tens of thousands of dollars in research and polling to inform those ads. So these are messages that have been tested with voters. in this case, if you think back, if voters in these districts think back, just a couple of cycles ago, there were even more nasty hits over workplace issues, and one candidate who at the time I think was involved in a senior home where someone had lost a limb. So it's actually less provocative than folks may have seen in the past. But again, you're kind of seeing the focus of the campaigns be around very fundamental things like infrastructure spending or attendance for the job. And I think that's kind of a product of how competitive these races are, and the fact that they're talking to a small number of voters who've not yet made their mind up about these very known candidates in both races. All are either incumbents or have been incumbents in other sort of, in that case, the state for, a decade. So it's getting harder to communicate to voters, but a new message or one that's kind of, move them, and a smaller number of voters that are actually undecided in both of these particular races, both 22 and 13.
Well, and Will, the difficult part here is, and Tal briefly touched on it, is that not only do you have the campaigns themselves running ads, but you have all these outside groups, and we pay attention to the disclaimer at the front end or the back end of the ad. Most people just see an ad for a candidate or against a candidate, and they just think, oh, the candidates' campaigns are running these ads. They don't think that there is big money from Washington, D.C. coming in from the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. And there's so much outside money in these races to try to frame up, so-and-so is really good at this or they're really weak at that. And because these campaigns are going to be won on the margins. I mean, the vote totals for both elections in 2022 were in the hundreds. So
Right.
This time turnout is going to be a little higher, or they're not 2020 high, but they will be greater than 2022. So it's an effort to either squeeze as much juice out of the lemon for your candidate as you possibly can, or drive people away from the other side to your candidate because you've scared them, you've made them feel stupid for voting for that candidate or whatever reason. And this is where, when we run campaigns, you can't control what these third party groups do.
Right.
And sometimes they help, and sometimes they're polling, they may do it, but you're like, where is this coming from? So very frustrating if you're running a candidate.
It's a really good point that Matt's making about that disclosure, and I think voters having a little bit better understanding of where the resources are coming from. So whether it's House Majority PAC or Congressional Leadership Fund, these are vehicles that are heavily influenced by the national parties, right, or the leadership in Washington, and they are very, I'd say, across the political spectrum, they're very capable of being completely tone deaf to what's actually happening in the district. There's a history there, right? So, for instance, in the San Joaquin Valley, the issue of immigration is a very nuanced one, right? It's very different. With our heavy reliance on ag labor, and in many cases, folks that probably don't have the appropriate documents in place as it relates to their citizenship, it's not as simple of an issue as you may find somewhere in the South or in a state that doesn't have the same reliance from an industry standpoint. No different than the abortion issue, which is, I think, on a national scene, probably a very good issue. The more time that people are talking about abortion nationally, the better for Democrats for the most part. However, in this particular part of the state, you do have a lot of socially conservative, likely skewing older Hispanic voters, where the abortion issue is not as cut and dry as it would be for a more reliable Democratic voting bloc, right? So the national parties, whether they be Republican or Democrat aligned, are very capable of missing the mark with some of these ads as it relates to outside spending. And that can be a liability for the campaigns. And as Matt mentioned, they're not, and they shouldn't be. It would be illegal for them to do so. They should not, and I would say for the vast majority of cases, are not coordinated in any way. So sometimes you kind of have your head in your hands wishing that the folks from Washington would just leave us alone, not unlike voters often feel themselves.
Exactly.
And in the whole quantity of things too, with the amount that you see on TV and whatnot, could it be a turnoff in the other way to say, which I mean, maybe is sometimes the goal of something too, which is to repress a vote or to keep some people at home. Is that also a strategy too with some of these ads, as opposed to just airing out the bad information about somebody?
Yeah, I look, I don't think so in either of these two races. Each side is trying to motivate their people to get to the polls. I mean, they're so close that the idea of a suppression campaign, I think that's, that evil genius, make the, oh, we can do it. Look, Occam's razor, the simplest solution is usually the most logical solution. People are just all four campaigns, if we want to take the races in general, they just want to get their voters to the poll either now or on election day because it's going to be a couple hundred seats in either direction, if I had to guess.
Yeah. Well, I'd say I tell folks it's not unlike that friend you have who's a realtor, who every time you're at a family event or a social event or you run into them at the supermarket, they may mention that, right? And it can be annoying at times. However, when you eventually need a realtor, you're probably going to remember that friend. So voters will routinely say that they don't like the ads, that they don't like getting the mail, that they don't like the digital ads. But I promise good campaigns aren't talking to them after the election, right? So after election day, you'll find that most of the advertising should stop unless the campaign's really off base. But it's all around getting voters, and in our case, they've got a few weeks leading up to the election, getting voters to cast the ballot. What's funny, and I'm sure Matt has a similar approach, folks that work in this space, we sometimes will purposely not turn our ballots in because we want to receive the mail. We want to receive some of the targeted digital ads, for instance, because it's fun to see what other folks in this profession are doing, right? So if you're a voter and you're tired of hearing from the campaigns, a good way to get them to be quiet is to turn your ballots in. And then all of a sudden, you'll probably hear from them far less.
Yeah, the good campaigns will remove the people that have already voted and
Right.
try to
That's a
save
good
money.
point.
Yeah.
Can you guys talk about that? How does it get tracked that you've already voted or something like that? In case people are wondering how that works.
So two things. One, I think that it should be a crime that we don't know who wins on election night, but when you accept ballots a week after, if they're postmarked, you're bumping this toward the future. That being said, the California Secretary of State is fantastic about, hey, I get a text and an email, hey, your ballot has been mailed. You should have received your ballot. Oh, your ballot is back at the post office and your ballot has been, it has been, held and to be counted. I mean, it's really amazing. And then that goes into the voter roll or voter file. And then any company that we use to buy lists when we're campaigning, they update them. And if it's a big turnout, you can save a lot of money, which means it's more money to be spent elsewhere on more digital or more TV or different mail. So, I mean, the California Secretary of State doesn't do the timeliness thing well, but this is one thing that they do really well, in my opinion.
Well, it's a good example, actually. When people who say you volunteer in a campaign or you're a new candidate and you're deciding to walk precincts, so you want to go door to door to your neighbors and talk to them about your running for, some office. It's always disappointing to a new candidate or a volunteer when you actually pull the list of people they should be talking to, because in reality, you'll walk up to a street and you only talk to 3 or 4 people on a particular street. And that's because, and this is the disappointing part, that's because many people won't vote. Many people are registered to vote, but vote hardly ever. Some have already turned their ballot in. Some are not actually registered to vote. In our region, some of them, may not have citizenship documents. So the number of people that are deciding an election relative to the number of people you may run into or in your social circles is pretty modest. And it's all the more reason that campaigns are attempting to become a little bit more precise and a little more sophisticated about the people they're talking to and getting that message directly to them. The vast majority still goes to the television advertising, as we discussed earlier, but you're seeing more targeted ways of reaching individual voters, trying to develop a relationship, delivering a compelling message to a smaller group of people. Because again, especially in a close race, one particular vertical that may not have any sort of significance nationally, but say a regional issue, that could decide the election if it comes down to a few hundred votes. And campaigns will, I would assume, increasingly get better at delivering those messages in a tailored way to a smaller number of voters. And there's ways you can do that now that you may have not had access to in the past, digital probably being the most obvious.
Yep.
And then just also when we think about a targeted ad, Tal, we talked about this last week, but you have this mailer that's going around. It's being mailed from a progressive group that is basically saying that Valadao, oh, he voted against Trump. He's not conservative enough for the district, and the idea is to send this to the Republicans in the district. Can you talk about the strategy that goes into that? Is it effective? Is it particularly effective with him in a district where people are like, oh yeah, we already know that he's
Yeah.
not voting that way?
So this is maybe too insider baseball in the weeds, but I think it's important for voters and your viewers to know. So I do think that's a very strategic and thoughtful approach. So you've got a progressive group that does not want David Valadao to serve another term in Congress, talking to Republican voters, reminding them of something that was pretty unpopular that David was involved in this case, the impeachment vote. So that is I believe it was through mail, a very targeted universe of people, right? So they don't want that message being broadcast all over the district because in this case, there's actually very high Democratic registration in that particular district. And that's not a message that a progressive group would want to share because it's confusing for voters, right? So if you're a Democratic voter, the fact that Congressman Valadao voted for impeachment a couple of years ago, that may be reason that you choose to support him, right? So this progressive group is talking to only Republicans and hoping that that creates a sense of confusion. Those folks will never vote for a Democrat. They'll never vote for Rudy Salas, but they might undervote. They might leave the race empty on their ballot. The interesting part about all of this is that you, Matt, and I talking this afternoon to a Kern County audience is precisely what that group does not want. So talking about this very issue is counter to the strategy, right? Because voters, heavily Democratic voters in Kern County, of which this district, that portion of the district there's a large advantage for Democratic registration in Kern County. They're now hearing this message. So it's an example of you can be strategic and you can be clever, but sometimes you can be a little too cute because if folks know what you're trying to do, it may well have the opposite effect. So if you only get it in the mailbox and it only goes to Republicans, maybe you go, well, shoot, I like President Trump. I must disagree with Congressman Valadao on that particular issue. Now I'm concerned. If you're a general election voter in Kern County, you're probably more likely to be a Democrat. And the fact that a group is reminding you that David voted for impeachment may be the reason that you cast your ballot for him.
Yeah. And Will, I think another way the most classic example of it, not in a general election, is Adam Schiff boosting Steve Garvey's candidacy so that he runs against Steve Garvey as opposed to running against Katie Porter. And instead of having a $60 to $80 million Democrat versus Democrat U.S. Senate race, there's a very uncompetitive Senate race where Adam Schiff doesn't have to really run a campaign. So, I mean, it's when you do it well, it's my hands never left my wrist and it's beautiful. Sometimes you do it really poorly and right, it could have unintended consequences, as Tal just pointed out.
And you have the potential for that district where Katie Porter currently represents the flip back to Republican, which will be a slight, I guess, disadvantage if anything happens there. And that's kind of where I want to leave this conversation, this last topic. I'm not going to ask for projections on either this seat or the Duarte Gray seat, but who do you think has momentum as we're heading into this final week? What is it looking? What is the outcome in the Central Valley as far as these races, these tie races are concerned, versus maybe the rest of California and some of these other swing congressional districts across the country? Who's coming out with the House majority this fall?
Well, I can't break down race by race, but I can tell you that I think the Democrats that I've spoken to feel very positive about a number of races up and down the state, particularly the two that we've been talking about here. I think that with 7 potential seats in play, that California actually means something on the national stage. We could be very relevant in determining whether we have the current speaker, up for another 2 more years, or whether Mr. Jeffries from the great state of New York becomes the next speaker. And I can also tell you that we won't know who will ultimately have that job unless there is a major turn of events on the national scale. We probably won't know for 2 or 3 weeks which party has control of the House. But I think that all things being equal, I think the Democrats have to be feeling really good right now for the House, Not for the other stuff, though.
Yeah, I mean, it's the question that the campaigns would love to have an answer for leading up to Tuesday, right? So I would say that if I'm batching the two races together, I do think there is a benefit to incumbency. So I think of the two races, that's probably, say that Valadao will likely perform a little better than Duarte. I could see both of these races, us having absolutely no idea on election night who won. Traditionally, a lot of the very late ballots would swing very heavily towards Democrats. I mean, I remember back in 2016, some of the late updates were 80-20 in favor of Democrats. If I recall, there was 2018 when Congressman Valadao, as an example, lost. He was up by, I think, 5 or 6% on election night. That's been sort of washed out a little bit as Republicans, for reasons that are unfortunate, I think lack of faith in the elections, have held their ballots and in some cases have been turning them in later, despite, for decades leading up to that when they turn them in early. So some of that may be sort of tempered by Republicans that hold their ballots a little later than they used to because of, I think, sort of unfounded concerns about election offices monkeying with votes, right? So all the more reason, I think they're both going to be close, and I think we probably won't know on election night. So buckle up, because voters in the San Joaquin Valley, it might be, a couple of weeks before we know who our members of Congress are. And that may, to Matt's point, if it's a close national scene, that could determine who gets the speaker's gavel.
Yeah, and as Matt was saying earlier too, I mean, he was saying great state of New York, which we can say now that the Dodgers have officially won the World Series. I don't know if I would have been able to agree with his assessment. I would have stopped it. I would have stopped at mid-answer. But yes, now that that's all done, we can say great state of New York.
I wouldn't have said it if there were a game 6. Put it that way.
Exactly. Perfect. That's all I wanted. But then that's the other state too, right? New York is also the state to watch. I know we were thinking about King Jeffries, but there's several races there too. We're speaking about that with Representative Valadao the other day as well. So you can check out that interview and the Rudy Salas interview that we just did. That'll be on our website later today as well too. So we're geared up. We're ready to go. Can't wait to see what happens. Then we might have to wait 2 weeks. So who knows? But in the meantime, we appreciate you both being on with us today, and have a great rest of your day, which is easy to do when the World Series run.
Awesome. Thanks, Will. Tal, nice to see you.